So, I've followed, the scenes that you basically helped build for many years online. But if you don't mind, I'd like to start in your own words. How would you describe the anti-folk scene that you were, such a big part of in New York City, and how did that all come to be?
Oh, well, I was a classical musician from an early age, and I was like a piano prodigy, age 5, 6, playing classical music. And I didn't listen to much pop music growing up. There was the AM radio on the way to piano lessons. For those 20 minutes, I would hear Music Radio 77 WABC, and I'd hear some pop music. But other than that, I didn't hear much. But eventually, fast forward, I got started getting into poetry as well as music, and then I discovered this thing called songs, which was the marriage of words and music, and I just became fascinated with songs.
Now, how
And
old were you at this point?
uh, about 16ish,
Okay.
and started looking into that. Then punk hit. Uh, I saw it was on 60 Minutes. There was a 60 Minutes on punk rock, this evil scourge coming from the UK. And I was watching this, and it just blew my mind. They had just a Sex Pistols and the Clash, and they were calling them musicians. I was like, how is that a musician? They're not wearing suits and ties, which is what I would wear when I'm playing Beethoven sonatas. So I went out the next day and got Sex Pistols, and I got the Clash, and I got the Jam, and loved it, and especially the Clash because of the lyrics. And then I went backwards and started learning about the predecessors. So Beatles, Stones, Doors, Dylan, back to Woody Guthrie. And I looked in the Village Voice and saw that, I'd gotten this biography on Dylan and saw that he played Gertie City in the village of New York. And I looked in the Village Voice and it was still going. So I headed down to the West Village, early 80s, and went to the open mic at Folk City, and thinking that they're going to totally dig what I do. But they did not dig that combination of punk and what they were calling folk. And so I was, it was a hard time there. And they said that I wasn't folk. And I didn't understand that because I'm a white guy playing 3 chords on an acoustic guitar. They're white guys playing 3 chords on acoustic guitar. How come they're folk and I'm not folk? And I quickly realized that was Dylan Electric, the people that the so-called folk artists that were left behind circled their wagons and said, we're not going to let this happen to us again. Because if you went to Tower Records, you had an entire floor that was rock and roll. Had one little bin that was folk music, but they wanted to stay the big cheeses in those little bins. And so when I came around combining punk with acoustic, they circled the wagons once again and kept getting kicked out of the clubs. And I started hanging out in the alleyway behind the clubs, and I would have like 30 people in the alleyway drinking 40s and playing punk folk acoustic music. And I said, well, this is crazy. And I was on Blue McDougal at the time, so I moved to the Lower East Side onto Rivington Street. And I got a loft space and I gutted it. I put in a stage. I slept on the stage during the day, and I would open up as a completely illegal after-hour club at night. In my first week running that club, they were running the New York Folk Festival in the West Village. So I decided to start the New York Anti-Folk Festival, along with some other people like Cindy Berryhill, Kirk Kelly, Billy Nova, Roger Manning. Those were some early people on that scene. And we just started our own thing there on Rivington Street. The Daily News called it the most dangerous block in New York City. So we put that piece of paper and put it on the wall. And that was the birth of it. That was the early 80s. And then it just continued to grow over the years as new waves of people arrived in the city. And I don't know how much I want to go in, but that's origins.
When did you find the home at the Sidewalk Cafe? I know you were at Sidewalk for a long time, and then I believe after Sidewalk you were elsewhere for a short period. But a lot of times when you hear people talk about the anti-hoot, they kind of they also are simultaneous with the Sidewalk Cafe. So when did that start up?
Yeah, well, that's actually quite interesting because there was at least 6, 7 years of anti-folk before I started running. So I ran it at Rivington Street for a year and a half. And then the cops came by and said, look, you know, because the cops were on my side. Because when the cops first came to us in the first couple of weeks, they were Irish cops, and Kirk Kelly, a wonderful singer-songwriter from the Lower East Side, Irish dude, he was on stage singing some Irish folk song when the cops came in, you know, the bus, and they were like, oh, nothing wrong here, laddie, keep, you know, it's okay. So I was in with the cops. But after about a year and a half, we started getting a lot of publicity, and the cops came back and were like, Lach, you know, we can give you another 2 weeks, but you got to get out of here. So I was like, oh, what do we do now? And my club was called The Fort, like the hidden fortress from Akira Kurosawa, but it just became The Fort. And I said, all right, let me keep the name and see if I could bring the club into another club. So the first place that we traveled to was Sophie's Bar, which at the time was where Sidewalk's Bar came. But that used to be Sophie's Bar, and Eddie Dixon and Trish and Snooky would be performing there. And I started running the Fort there, and then she moved to Fifth Street, and moved with her, and we started having our first acts signed. So Roger Manning got signed to Black Flag's label, and so did Kirk Kelly. Michelle Schacht, her album came out on Cooking Vinyl. So that was like the first big wave of anti-folk out of Sophie's Bar. And then Brenda Kahn got signed to Columbia. And the Fort moved around to other clubs. So mainly Sophie's, and at a club called Chameleon Bar, which is on 6th Street, which was 6th Street between A and B. That's where Paleface and Beck came onto the scene, was there. And then I was out in San Francisco for a little while, and I ran a scene out there. When I came back to New York in 92, I stopped in Sidewalk to visit a friend of mine, Laura, from the band Mongrel Bitch. And she said, oh, the owners here want to do something with the back room. Could you give them some advice and insight on how to have live music back there? And they came over. I was not planning to stay in New York. I was planning to go on to Europe. But I gave them a bunch of advice, and they said, well, can you start working here and run it? And I said, well, I could run it for a couple of weeks until I get you on your feet, and then, you know, have someone else do it. And then I stayed there for 15 years. And so a lot of people, when they think of anti-folk, they think of Sidewalk, but there was a lot of history before we even got to Sidewalk. And the early years of Sidewalk had their own history. A lot of people associate the period of the late 90s at Sidewalk, I think, because that's when we had a very good wave of anti-folk with the Moldy Peaches, Jeffrey Lewis, Regina Spektor. I had the Anti-Hoot cable show on Manhattan Cable. You know, so there's just been these waves of it. And after Sidewalk, I wasn't going to do anything, but I ended up doing stuff at Webster Hall for a year or two. I became executive producer over there and had some wild times. And then I moved here where I live now, to Scotland. I live in Edinburgh now.